Under the mild morning sun of Northern California, Laura Davis parked her work van in the gravel driveway of her new home. A single-story, adobe-style house perched near the end of a quiet street where every lawn seemed cut to the same height and every resident followed a rulebook no one ever agreed to write. For Laura, the move was less about the neighborhood and more about the workshop. The detached garage, already wired and plumbed, had been the deciding factor. After running her late father's portable generator business for over a decade, Laura knew how rare it was to find a residential property that could accommodate heavy-duty machinery without the city breathing down her neck. The workshop meant freedom, efficiency, and legacy. It had been 3 months since she relocated. In that time, she had transformed the garage into a well-oiled production space, stocked with tool racks, hydraulic lifts, a custom-built soldering bench, and climate-controlled storage for lithium-ion cells. Her father's spirit lingered in every detail. Every bolt bin sorted to his precise logic, every custom tool hook hung at the exact ergonomic height he used to insist on. He had passed 3 years prior, leaving Laura with not just the business but the burden of protecting its integrity in an industry that was rapidly shifting toward flashy, tech-heavy solutions he had always distrusted. Laura herself was methodical by nature, steadfast, analytical, deliberate. She wasn't the kind to chase trends or embellish function with fluff. Her systems were built to last, tested under stress, and she never installed anything without knowing exactly how to fix it blindfolded. So when she installed a hybrid solar backup power system onto her new house, she didn't outsource it to some green tech startup. She designed it herself. A combination of high-output solar panels, a fortified inverter bank, deep-cycle battery walls, and a multi-layered failover switch system ensured uninterrupted power not just for her home, but for the entire workshop. She had the permits. She had the inspections. And she had the confidence that, barring an earthquake or a full-blown infrastructure collapse, her lights weren't going out anytime soon. At first, everything had worked beautifully. The system thrived in the long California days, charging the battery banks fully by mid-afternoon and distributing power through the smart load balancer Laura had configured from scratch. For the first 6 weeks, the energy graphs displayed exactly what she expected: a steady harvest curve in daylight hours, a smooth decline overnight, and minor blips in usage when she fired up heavier equipment in the shop. Then, on the 7th week, something changed. It started subtly. The battery levels would drop faster than usual during daylight hours. Noticeably so. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to irritate someone who checked her logs as religiously as Laura did. At first, she assumed it was due to a shift in weather, overcast skies, or some minor calibration drift in the MPPT controller. She ran diagnostics. Everything checked out. No irregularities in the panels, no shadowing, no inverter faults. But the loss curve continued. By week 9, her batteries were hitting low thresholds by late afternoon, which made no sense, especially when she hadn't increased her own usage. She rechecked the baseline load for the house. Fridge, HVAC, workshop idle draw, unchanged. No new devices, no parasitic drain. She even disabled the HVAC system for a day to test whether the compressor had gone rogue. Still, the batteries drained like someone had opened a tap. She reset the logs, updated the firmware, even swapped out 2 of the inline sensors. And yet, the draw continued. Laura's concern turned into suspicion on a Saturday afternoon when she walked out to inspect the junction box at the side of her house. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just following her instinct. That's when she saw it. A faint line in the dust, a fresh impression in the dirt, as though someone had dragged a cable or a pipe across the side yard. Her house sat on the lot's edge, with her property line bordering directly against her neighbor's, the only stretch of fence that wasn't concrete but an older cedar slat job that had begun to bow at the center from years of wind. Her neighbor, Karen Malloy, was an attorney in her mid-50s who had introduced herself within minutes of Laura's arrival months ago. She had arrived with a fruit basket and a list of neighborhood guidelines, none of which were legally binding but all of which, as Karen had assured her, keep the spirit of the community intact. Laura remembered nodding politely, accepting the fruit, and immediately discarding the pamphlet. Karen was sharp, articulate, and always smiling just a bit too wide, the kind of person who turned compliments into directives and suggestions into veiled judgments. Laura hadn't thought much of her beyond that, though she had noticed the Tesla Model Y parked outside Karen's house most days, usually plugged into a glossy wall-mounted charging station that had apparently been installed without professional assistance. That evening, Laura did something she rarely did. She turned off the shop and sat down with a legal pad. She began listing possibilities, rational ones. Had someone in the neighborhood piggybacked onto her line? Could her setup be feeding another system through a fault? No, impossible. She had triple-checked the isolation during installation. There were no shared lines, no communal access points, and even if there were, she would have seen the load increase show up in the diagnostics. Unless... The thought hit her slowly, then all at once. Not a fault in the system, a deliberate tap. Someone was siphoning power directly, bypassing her monitoring nodes entirely. She scribbled out the other theories. This wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was technical theft, electrical larceny. The term sounded absurd, even in her head, but she couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, she made a quiet call to a trusted electrician she had worked with on municipal contracts. She didn't need him to fix anything. She needed him to verify something and document it properly. The inspection confirmed her worst suspicion. Someone had tapped into her system via a buried line that disappeared into the side fence and, presumably, into Karen's backyard. It was cleverly done, using shielded conduit and a junction diverter camouflaged in mulch near the fence posts. It wasn't DIY grade. Whoever had done this had experience, and enough boldness to drill into a stranger's energy system without detection. The electrician, Rick, took photos, documented the line routing, and drafted a service affidavit. No accusations, just a neutral statement of what had been observed and where the unauthorized draw had occurred. Laura stood on the edge of her lot, staring at the fence. She didn't knock. She didn't call Karen out. Instead, she called the county utility inspector's office and scheduled a site review under property resource misuse. No dramatics. No front porch shouting matches, just paper, signatures, and verification. Karen, for her part, didn't make a scene either, at least not at first. When the inspector arrived 3 days later, she greeted them with practiced professionalism, all smiles and legal vocabulary, claiming she had no idea how such a line could have been installed. But her facade cracked when the inspector asked to see her Tesla's charging interface and traced the power feed back through a second conduit that had been hastily buried with new soil. The inspector made no accusations either. He simply took notes, thanked both parties, and stated that the matter would be referred to the appropriate department for review. It wasn't until that night, when Laura found the access panel to her inverter box left unlatched and the voltage logs suddenly wiped, that she realized the game had changed. What had started as a quiet technical issue had become something else entirely. Someone had come onto her property, not to take more power, but to erase the evidence. The following morning arrived without incident, but Laura's sense of unease only deepened. She didn't sleep well the night before, not because she feared confrontation, but because the violation sat under her skin like a splinter. Someone had entered her property with intent. Not curiosity, not mischief, but precision and purpose. The unauthorized draw from her system was bad enough. The intrusion into her inverter box, the erased logs, that crossed a different kind of boundary. This was no longer about energy consumption. It was about control, about audacity, about someone believing she wouldn't notice or wouldn't respond. That miscalculation, more than anything, stoked her focus into fire. She began by reinforcing the basics. The inverter housing was relocked and resecured with a new panel latch, not one from the standard catalog, but a reinforced lockbox designed for outdoor industrial arrays. She rerouted critical diagnostics to an encrypted local node, disconnected from the broader network, ensuring any future tampering would leave forensic traces. The workshop lights were dimmed, the entry logs enabled, and she adjusted her habits, no longer working into the early hours but leaving motion-triggered lights to keep the property illuminated at irregular intervals. It wasn't paranoia, it was policy. Laura wasn't one to play defense, but she knew how to tighten a perimeter when the stakes changed. 3 days later, she received her first formal correspondence from the neighborhood council. The envelope arrived by courier, unusual in itself, considering internal mail was typically dropped off weekly by a local volunteer. Inside was a letter with polite but pointed language, informing her that several residents had voiced concerns about her solar array, specifically its visual impact, its non-conformity with neighborhood aesthetics, and, most strangely, its potential interference with the shared electrical grid. It was a letter designed not to accuse, but to intimidate through oblique warnings and regulatory jargon. Laura read it twice, her lips tightening into a smile devoid of humor. There was no mention of Karen, but the subtext was clear. Someone had made noise. And now the council was reacting, either out of pressure or because they too were being manipulated. Laura drafted her response that evening. It wasn't angry or defensive. It was meticulous. She attached copies of her installation permits, inspection clearance forms, and a compliance letter from the county's Renewable Energy Division. She annotated each paragraph of their letter with legal citations and regulatory counterpoints. She made it clear that not only was her system compliant, it exceeded code on every point. Then she sent it by certified mail, with copies to the County Utilities Board, the Municipal Zoning Office, and the Regional Building Inspector. Still, she knew the administrative maneuvering wasn't the real battlefield. Karen hadn't stopped, and she wasn't going to, not until something more decisive pushed her back. That knowledge was confirmed the following week when Laura returned from a weekend delivery run to find her workshop breaker tripped and 3 of her smart relays fused from an induced overload. The shop's environmental controls had shut down automatically, but the temperature spike had already affected several heat-sensitive components. Damaged goods, lost inventory. And again, no direct evidence, only the unmistakable fingerprints of someone who knew how to push just hard enough to leave a wound without a scar. She didn't report it. Not yet. Not because she doubted law enforcement, but because she understood its limits. This was the kind of campaign that thrived in ambiguity. Electrical faults, neighborhood complaints, whispers of non-compliance. No single incident stood as a smoking gun. But the accumulation was mounting, and Laura wasn't about to let the pressure erode her position. She needed documentation, timing, and a plan rooted not in confrontation, but in revelation. So she called a second electrician. Not one who knew her, but someone recommended through a professional contractors network, an expert in forensic diagnostics. His job was simple: run a discreet but thorough audit of her entire system, mapping load flows, surge events, and irregular draw patterns. She didn't tell him what to find, just what to look for. 2 days later, he returned with a detailed report showing irregular line activity during council meeting hours, when most systems in the neighborhood were at their lowest usage. Power was being drawn not just when she was away, but precisely when her own systems were on scheduled standby, creating minimal local demand. That meant whoever was tapping her system wasn't just stealing energy. They were scheduling it to look natural, masking the consumption against periods of predictable low draw. Laura filed the report with the Utility Oversight Committee anonymously. Not a complaint, but a submission under the potential infrastructure exploit category. This triggered an automatic review and, more importantly, a technician visit to the area grid. Karen didn't know that, of course. To her, everything seemed quiet, but beneath the surface, threads were pulling tighter. Then came the call from the council's legal liaison, requesting Laura's presence at the upcoming meeting. To address community concerns, he said. Laura confirmed, already understanding what was coming. This wouldn't be a discussion. It would be a performance. They would corner her, present vague allegations, try to shame her into either compliance or silence. But Laura had no intention of playing the role they'd written for her. She arrived at the meeting prepared. Her folders were labeled. Her documents were tabbed. Her tone was measured but unyielding. The room was full. Dozens of neighbors seated in rows, most with no idea why they were even present. Karen was seated near the front, her arms folded across her lap, her smile as thin as a blade. The chairperson opened the meeting with procedural language, then turned the floor over to Laura. She stood, greeted them formally, and began her presentation, not with accusations, but with data. She outlined the parameters of her system, its grid compliance, the dates of all inspections. She passed around printed energy graphs showing normal operation until the 9th week, and then the sudden deviation. She didn't mention Karen. She didn't need to. She only outlined the facts: unidentified draw patterns, unauthorized access points, and logged physical intrusion verified by 2 third-party professionals. Then she paused. She didn't say, "I know who did it." She didn't say, "I demand punishment." She simply said, "I filed my documentation with the regional oversight body. I trust they'll follow protocol. I'm here because this affects more than just me, and I believe you deserve to know what's happening." For a moment, the room was silent, not hostile, stunned. They had expected defensiveness, evasion. Instead, they had received professionalism and evidence. A few eyes drifted toward Karen, who remained composed but visibly rigid, her jaw tight beneath her carefully painted smile. The meeting adjourned awkwardly. No one challenged Laura directly. No one defended Karen either. The chairperson thanked her in a clipped tone and promised to review the material. 2 nights later, Laura woke at 3:12 a.m. to a faint, unfamiliar humming sound. She sat up, heart already tightening with dread. The inverter room. She grabbed her flashlight and made her way through the hallway in silence. Outside, the breeze was still, the air thick with coastal fog. She opened the side hatch and immediately noticed the smell. Acrid, chemical, unmistakable. Burned plastic. She swept the light across the housing and saw the melted edge of one of the surge breakers. A spike had hit the line. Not one generated by the grid, but by an external source. Purposeful, targeted. She shut everything down, locked the box, and went back inside, trembling not from fear, but from the weight of inevitability. Karen wasn't retreating. She was escalating. And Laura was running out of middle ground. At sunrise, Laura stood in the center of her workshop, staring at the diagnostic display on her central power console. The screen was black, unresponsive, dead as a stone. The backup systems had failed to switch over automatically, which meant that the surge from the night before had bypassed at least 2 safeguards, both of which she had calibrated herself. This wasn't an accident or a power grid anomaly. It was calculated. And now it wasn't just her personal energy independence or sense of privacy that had been violated. It was her livelihood. The workbench refrigeration units were offline, temperature-sensitive components compromised, and half a day's productivity wiped out before her coffee had finished brewing. She didn't slam tools or scream. That wasn't her style. Instead, she opened her ledger and began the damage assessment. 2 variable resistors in the inverter were toast, and the primary control relay had blown. The surge hadn't just targeted her household system, it had traveled far enough downline to strike the production side of the shop. That meant it either originated close to the source panel or was fed from a high-load return. It also meant someone knew exactly where her system vulnerabilities were, and there was only one person in her vicinity who had both motive and brazen disregard for legality to act on that knowledge. Laura took a breath and picked up her phone, not to call Karen, and not even to call the council. She called the county fire department's arson and electrical safety division. She spoke calmly, relayed the incident, and requested a site inspection. not out of panic, but because the fire risk posed by an unshielded surge line was now a matter of public safety. Within 2 hours, a certified electrical investigator arrived with a thermal sensor kit and a rugged inspection drone. Laura led him through the property, answered each of his questions with sharp clarity, and let the evidence speak louder than any accusation she might have made. The inspector found subtle heat scarring on the edge of the panel, inconsistent with lightning or grid feedback. He documented everything, tagged the equipment, and promised to escalate the case. By mid-afternoon, Laura had reinforced the interior wiring, replaced the compromised components with temporary backups, and rerouted the load away from the solar intake, switching entirely to battery for the next 72 hours. She didn't want anything entering or leaving her system that she hadn't explicitly programmed. She installed a separate analog recorder, something even the most sophisticated tampering couldn't erase, and mounted it in a locked steel case beside the primary relay. Then she packed a file folder with everything she had accumulated so far: reports, timestamps, logs, surge maps, and photographic evidence. She wasn't going to wave them around. She wasn't going to present them at another meeting. She was going to take them where they actually mattered. The next morning, Laura made an appointment with a private energy consultant, someone not affiliated with the utility companies, someone who had testified in civil court cases involving sabotage, wiretapping, and grid manipulation. She didn't have to prove that Karen had done anything, yet. All she needed was a certified statement from a third-party expert confirming that the damage to her system could not have occurred naturally or through normal grid flux. When she met the consultant in his modest office just outside the county limits, she explained her situation in clear, clinical terms. He nodded, made notes, and then asked for copies of her internal power logs and all associated system schematics. She handed them over without hesitation. The man took his time. He was slow, methodical, and visibly impressed by the depth of her documentation. 2 hours later, he looked up and said, "You're not paranoid. This is surgical. Someone went after your weak points. You're lucky your inverters failed cleanly." He provided her with an affidavit and a notarized statement indicating that the system had been deliberately targeted through an external surge consistent with proximity line injection. A rare, but real, method of electrical sabotage. With that in hand, Laura scheduled a consultation with a civil attorney. She didn't want damages. She didn't even want an arrest. She wanted leverage, the kind that stopped further escalation and made it legally impossible for Karen or anyone else to justify further interference. The attorney, a woman in her early 40s named Elena Marquez, was straightforward and unsentimental. She read the file carefully, asked pointed questions about previous incidents, and nodded at Laura's restraint. "You did everything right. But be aware, people like her don't just stop, they test limits. When they find resistance, they don't retreat. They regroup." Laura asked what her legal standing was if another surge occurred or if the council attempted to censure her under pressure from Karen. Marquez was clear. Any further damage following the filing of this report could be legally classified as criminal sabotage. She recommended filing a temporary cease and desist with a judge, preemptively, limited in scope, but symbolic and enforceable. Laura agreed. 2 days later, a formal cease and desist letter was delivered to Karen's residence. It made no direct accusations, only outlined the damage, noted the investigative findings, and formally requested that any interaction with Laura's property, physical, electrical, or otherwise, cease immediately pending further review. Karen didn't acknowledge it. She didn't respond. But the next morning, Laura found a new flyer taped to her front door. The flyer looked like a standard community bulletin, cheap paper, inkjet printed, full of faux cheerful clip art and anonymous wording. It accused a certain resident of compromising neighborhood safety through unauthorized electrical installations, warned of potential fire hazards, and encouraged residents to file complaints with the county if they felt unsafe. Laura smiled, grimly. Karen had gone from covert sabotage to public manipulation. It wasn't clever, it was desperate. And worse, It was working. Over the next week, Laura noticed changes. A neighbor who had once waved now avoided eye contact. Someone threw coffee grounds into her recycle bin. Her outgoing mail was delayed twice. A delivery went missing from her porch. Small things, petty things, but all of it aimed at isolating her. She began seeing Karen more frequently, at the grocery store, at the park, once even parked across the street in her Tesla, idling for no apparent reason. Laura never approached, never reacted, but she documented every appearance, every strange occurrence, quietly, consistently. Then came the second meeting summons. This time, it wasn't from the council. It was from the county mediator's office. Karen had filed a formal complaint under the Civil Harmony Act, claiming that Laura's behavior and non-compliant installations were creating a hostile and unsafe living environment. It was a masterstroke, twisting the narrative into one of victimhood, using institutional language to trigger a response from the system. Laura was required to attend the mediation or risk forfeiting her right to present her own evidence. She showed up prepared, wearing a simple navy blouse and slate gray slacks, hair pulled back, no makeup. Professional, unobtrusive, unshakable. Karen arrived in a pristine beige pantsuit, with her ever-present smile and a leather folder in hand. The mediator, a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a practiced neutrality, asked both parties to explain their sides. Karen went first, painting a picture of escalating tension. A neighbor who installed unauthorized tech, generated unpredictable power surges, and refused to communicate. She spoke of stress, of sleepless nights, of fear. She did not raise her voice. She was good, trained, practiced. Then it was Laura's turn. She handed the mediator a copy of the forensic report, the investigator's statement, the cease and desist, and her attorney's letter. She spoke factually, without embellishment. She showed photographs of damage. She referenced timestamps. She did not speculate or accuse. She didn't need to. The paperwork told the story. The mediator leaned back, flipping through the documents in silence. Karen's composure flickered. She tried to interrupt once, claiming the surge report didn't prove anything. The mediator silenced her with a raised hand. "Mrs. Malloy, we're not here to debate technicalities. We're here to determine whether a pattern of harassment exists. And I must say, the material here is thorough." The session ended with no resolution, only a formal recommendation that both parties disengage from direct interaction, and that any further disputes be routed through legal channels. Karen stormed out first. Laura thanked the mediator, shook his hand, and left without looking back. That night, her battery logs showed another anomaly. Small, brief, but deliberate. Someone was still testing her. Laura stood in the dark workshop, eyes narrowed, the silence around her humming with a challenge unspoken, but understood. The line had been crossed. The damage had been done. And now, she wasn't just responding. She was planning. The shift didn't come with a dramatic incident or some final straw. It came with a realization. Quiet, incremental, but irreversible. Laura stood in the narrow corridor between her workshop's back wall and the fencing that separated her property from Karen's. There, half buried beneath decorative bark chips and purposefully spaced stones, she found a second conduit. Thinner, more discreet than the first, but this one didn't lead to her inverter. It ran in reverse, feeding directly from her primary fuse rail, bypassing the meters entirely. Whoever had installed it had used commercial-grade conduit caps and disguised the route with landscaper's precision. It was an amateur's logic disguised by professional materials, likely installed by someone Karen had hired under a side contract, someone who knew how to avoid city permits. The theft was more elaborate than she'd realized. This wasn't simply a neighbor stealing some current to charge her vehicle. This was an engineered parasitic loop, and the further Laura traced it without touching, just mapping the path visually, the clearer it became that it had been in place far longer than she had suspected. That night, she met again with Elena Marquez, her attorney, and laid out the expanded evidence: photographs, conduit samples, wire gauge measurements, and the buried node location. Elena took it all in without blinking, her expression unreadable but focused. She was already building a case, not for civil recovery, but for criminal misappropriation of infrastructure. The moment the circuit was tied to property damage, already established by the surge report, it was elevated to felony-grade interference. But Elena warned her again. Pressing charges meant escalation, and escalation meant exposure. Karen was deeply embedded in community boards, legal circles, and had friends in local enforcement. There was a chance they'd fight back with countersuits, with defamation claims, or with procedural delays designed to bankrupt the process. Laura didn't flinch. She didn't want to sue. She wanted it to stop. They decided on a different course. Instead of going through the criminal route, Laura would move forward with a preemptive injunction, a civil restraining order tied not to personal conduct, but to infrastructural tampering. It was obscure, seldom used, but effective. It allowed a judge to issue a ruling that prohibited any alteration, connection, or manipulation of a specific property's utility systems by any third party, pending full investigation. Helena filed the paperwork, attached all the documented evidence, and requested an emergency hearing. In the meantime, Laura took steps to ensure there would be no further interference. She had the utility company physically reroute the grid interface to bypass the public access loop. It was costly and required 3 technicians, but by the time they were done, the house was effectively self-contained, with no externally accessible entry point into the electrical system. Any future tampering would have to be internal, and therefore unmistakably illegal. But Laura wasn't done. She had spent weeks playing defense, building files, dodging accusations, repairing damage. That phase was over. Now it was time to push back, not through retaliation but through structured, visible truth. She reached out to a local inspection firm that specialized in documenting commercial compliance issues, the kind of outfit that normally dealt with small factories and complex HVAC audits. She hired them to run a full-scale verification of her property, electrical, structural, and environmental, and to publish the findings as a public-facing report. The goal wasn't just to clear her name, it was to make the reality unassailable, to remove any foothold Karen had in the neighborhood narrative. When the inspectors arrived, she stayed out of their way. They took notes, ran voltage load tests, checked grounding, measured noise interference, and photographed every relevant connection. Their lead technician, a stern woman with years of experience in high-voltage architecture, nodded in quiet approval more than once. At the end of the session, she said, "You're over-engineered. That's rare in residential setups. If anything, your neighbors should be asking for your help, not reporting you." The final report was delivered in a leather-bound packet 3 days later. Laura made copies and mailed one to each council member, one to the county records office, and one to her legal file. Then she went to the next neighborhood meeting. Not to argue, not to defend herself, but simply to sit in the front row with the packet on the chair beside her. Karen arrived 10 minutes late. Her hair was tied back in a sleek bun, and her expression betrayed nothing. But Laura saw the way her eyes narrowed when she spotted the report. Midway through the meeting, as budget allocations and zoning noise were being discussed, Karen raised her hand and motioned for attention. She began speaking about growing concerns over unregulated electrical installations and the risk of grid pollution from overpowered systems. Her tone was civil, but the meaning was aimed directly at Laura. Before she could finish, one of the council members, James Hall, a retired engineer who had mostly stayed silent in previous discussions, interrupted politely. "Ms. Malloy," he said, "we've received documentation from the compliance audit. It appears the system in question not only meets all regulatory thresholds but actually outperforms the grid's own safeguards. I think we can close that issue, don't you?" Karen paused, visibly stunned for a fraction of a second before nodding and folding her hands. But the tension didn't vanish. It changed form. She knew now that her narrative had lost ground. The false concern, the insinuation, it had been publicly cut off. The only tool left was silence, passive hostility, and Laura could feel it thicken the air as the meeting continued. Afterward, several neighbors approached her, not to apologize, but to express quiet support. A couple even asked if she could help them inspect their own solar setups. She didn't make promises. She didn't ask for gratitude. She simply said she'd think about it. She knew better than to assume the battle was over. But the momentum had shifted, and Karen's grip on the community's perception was slipping. What Laura didn't expect was the next move. Not from Karen directly, but from the systems Karen had manipulated for so long. A routine municipal notice arrived in Laura's mailbox, informing her that her property had been selected for infrastructure assessment as part of a new safety pilot program. It sounded innocuous, but she knew better. The timing was too perfect, the language too vague. It meant someone had called in a favor, possibly multiple. She contacted Elena immediately, and together they drafted a challenge, demanding to know the legal basis for the selection, the scope of the assessment, and the specific complaints that had triggered it. Within 48 hours, the request was withdrawn. No explanation, just a bland message stating that her property no longer met the selection criteria. Laura didn't need confirmation to understand what had happened. The walls were closing in on Karen, and someone, whether in the council or beyond, had finally realized they'd backed the wrong person. Laura stood in her driveway later that week, watching the sun dip behind her panels. She felt no triumph, no relief, only clarity. This wasn't about electricity anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. This was about territory, about perception, about who was allowed to draw lines and who was expected to obey them. Karen had assumed Laura was like the others, easily intimidated, politely compliant. But she wasn't. She never had been. She adjusted the straps on her tool bag and turned back toward the house, already thinking about her next redesign. Whatever happened next, she would be ready. Not just protected, prepared. The signs of retaliation were subtle at first, but unmistakable to someone like Laura, who had grown used to tracking patterns through noise. Her packages began arriving late or rerouted entirely, often marked as recipient unavailable despite her being home. 2 invoices for delivered but missing equipment mysteriously vanished from her email records and reappeared only after contacting the distributors by phone. Her online orders were inexplicably flagged for fraud review, triggering delays and additional verification steps she had never encountered before. And while none of it amounted to direct sabotage, each incident layered inconvenience on top of stress, not enough to derail her business, but enough to create a constant hum of interference that couldn't be ignored. The message was clear. If she wouldn't retreat, they would attempt to surround her with friction. It wasn't just virtual interference either. More than once, she returned from supply runs to find footprints in her gravel, too small to be delivery personnel, too erratic to be from animals. On one occasion, she discovered a smear of grease on the keypad of her rear gate, as though someone unfamiliar with its locking pattern had attempted to force it manually. She installed additional locks, replaced her gate keypad with a biometric model, and doubled the motion sensors near her back fence. She didn't contact the police. She didn't need a paper trail that wouldn't be taken seriously. What she needed was control over her systems, her environment, her evidence. Then came the breach that changed everything. One afternoon, while performing a routine test on her automated switching relay, she detected a sudden spike on line B, one of the internal circuits that should have been completely isolated. She shut down the breaker, ran a diagnostic, and discovered that one of the output channels had been overridden, rerouted without her command. A bypass trigger buried 3 subroutines deep in the controller's firmware. It wasn't a factory flaw. It was a code injection. Someone had tampered with the logic board, not physically but via proximity device, likely through a short-range wireless override that could only function within 10 meters of the panel, meaning someone had stood within spitting distance of her relay system with a portable tool, masked their signal, and rewritten her switch configuration in real time. That was no longer trespassing. That was infiltration. Laura called Elena immediately and relayed the finding. Within hours, Elena had secured an emergency consultation with a private digital forensics expert, someone who specialized in smart infrastructure sabotage. They scanned her system, verified the injection point, and cross-referenced the intrusion against known firmware backdoors used in older, commercial-grade override tools. The result was definitive. Someone had used a modified utility technician's handheld device to access her system through an exploited diagnostic port. It was illegal in at least 3 ways and traceable, if not directly to the operator, then to the hardware manufacturer, and from there to a distribution log. Laura submitted the data to the forensics firm and authorized Elena to file a motion for discovery, aiming to obtain distributor logs that could trace where such a tool had been registered in the county. That same week, another letter arrived from the council, this one far less polite. It cited complaints of excessive electromagnetic emissions, allegedly tied to her power array, which, according to the letter, posed potential interference with neighborhood communications infrastructure. It was thinly veiled nonsense, of course. Her systems were tested, grounded, and shielded beyond regulation. But the accusation had been worded in just the right way to trigger an official review under the county's utility oversight statutes. Laura knew immediately that Karen had changed tactics. It was no longer about damaging her property or credibility. It was about forcing her into procedural gridlock, overwhelming her with compliance audits, legal notices, and technical allegations, hoping that exhaustion would succeed where sabotage had failed. Elena moved fast. She filed a motion to suspend all municipal action against Laura pending the results of the forensic investigation, citing active tampering and electronic interference. The county temporarily paused their review, but the signal was clear. Karen, or someone working closely with her, had access to channels Laura had underestimated, and they were willing to use them without hesitation. What they didn't realize was that Laura had already begun her own quiet escalation, not with vengeance, but with calculation. She began by isolating every exterior-facing component of her energy network and rigging it with fault-tolerant, one-directional current filters, devices she had designed herself, initially as part of an anti-theft solution for portable generator kits. These filters didn't block current but redirected it selectively in response to sudden backflow, creating a controlled surge that traveled outward from her grid to any external device that attempted to draw without handshake authentication. It wasn't dangerous. It wouldn't fry consumer-grade appliances, but it would cause voltage overload warnings on any unapproved receiver, potentially triggering shutdowns or, at minimum, forced resets. It was perfectly legal. It was passive. And it was invisible unless you knew to look for it. She called it her electrical fingerprinting system. And, over the next few days, she began logging anomalies, spikes, and forced shutdown triggers in her perimeter network. On the 3rd test cycle, one of the returns logged a discharge consistent with a high-capacity EV charger failing mid-cycle. The timestamp matched perfectly with one of the neighborhood board meetings hosted just 2 houses down. One Karen had arrived at driving her usual Tesla Model Y. Laura didn't need more confirmation. She had her proof. Not the final kind a prosecutor might use, but the kind that would force a reckoning in the one space Karen couldn't manipulate: public consequence. She didn't go to the police. She didn't leak the report. Instead, she contacted the utility company under the guise of a product test inquiry, submitted her voltage discharge logs for anomalous draw patterns, and requested their analysis. Within days, they flagged the readings as inconsistent with standard usage and forwarded the data to their Network Integrity Division. Then, without warning, they dispatched a mobile technician to the neighborhood to investigate substation anomalies. It was a standard protocol, and from a distance it looked routine. But Laura knew better. When the technician stopped in front of Karen's house and walked toward the garage with a handheld EM reader, she knew the surge had landed. Karen's vehicle, a sleek powder blue Model Y with custom rims, sat idle in the driveway. When the technician opened his reader and began logging discharge patterns, Laura observed from her window. Not gloating, not even satisfied, but focused. Moments later, the technician knocked on Karen's door. She didn't answer. A second technician arrived, this time with a clipboard and a standard service jacket. Still no response. They logged something, took a few pictures, and left. The following day, Karen's Tesla sat parked on the street, unplugged. The charger was gone. And that evening, an emergency meeting was called, not by Karen, but by the council chair, who had received a notice from the utility authority requesting infrastructure access for further testing. The meeting was sparsely attended, but tense. Laura sat silently while the chair outlined the issue, warned that any unauthorized modifications to shared grid lines would result in fines and public notices. Karen didn't speak. Her eyes never left Laura's. After the meeting, a neighbor approached Laura in the parking lot, a man she barely knew, but who had previously waved in passing. "I don't know what's going on," he said, "but whatever you're doing, it's working. People are starting to ask questions, the kind Karen can't answer." Laura nodded, said nothing, and drove home. That night, her system recorded a final anomaly, a burst of voltage, brief, clumsy, amateurish. Someone had tried to re-engage the bypass line using a portable inverter. It failed instantly. Her filters caught it, redirected the surge, and dumped the load into a grounding trap. The external panel tripped, and the signal went dead. The following morning, a note was left in her mailbox. No name, no signature. Just 3 words printed in block letters. "You made enemies." Laura folded the paper, walked inside, and placed it on her desk. Then she opened a new file on her system, labeled it Failsafe Protocols, and began writing. Rain fell in slow sheets that morning, painting the sky in muted tones of steel and blurring the edges of the neighborhood's manicured facades. Laura stood beneath the awning of her workshop, sipping black coffee from a chipped metal mug, her eyes fixed on the panel embedded into the siding where her filtered grid interface now hummed with a quiet, self-contained rhythm. Her system was hardened, her evidence compiled. But the sense of waiting had grown heavier, like the pressure that builds before a circuit fails. Not sudden, but certain. Karen had gone quiet in the days following the utility investigation. Too quiet. The kind of silence that always signaled the reconfiguration of strategy. The slow, methodical repositioning of someone who had been publicly cornered and would now seek revenge in ways less visible but no less venomous. Laura had no illusions that exposure had defeated Karen. People like her didn't concede. They recalculated. When the invitation arrived in her mailbox, Laura read it twice. It was not a flyer, not an official notice from the council, but a sleek, professionally printed card embossed with the neighborhood emblem, inviting her to the Community Resilience and Technology Open Forum. The event, hosted by the council, was pitched as a forward-thinking discussion about infrastructure modernization, power autonomy, and neighborhood preparedness. But beneath the sugar-coated language was a trap. The meeting was being held at the Central Neighborhood Hall, and the listed speaker was none other than Karen Malloy, now rebranded as Technology and Safety Chair. Laura almost laughed. The position didn't exist. Karen had created it for herself, an artificial title designed to reclaim authority under the guise of progress. But Laura didn't decline. She RSVP'd through the official channel and spent the next 24 hours preparing. She didn't bring a briefcase. She didn't carry a stack of documents. Everything she needed was already embedded in the system logs, duplicated on offline media, and time-stamped through third-party verification. The real statement wouldn't come through words. It would come through consequence. Her electrical fingerprinting system, once a defensive measure, had been recalibrated for one specific task: to respond to any attempt at unauthorized draw with an automated feedback surge. Not harmful to the grid, not dangerous, but enough to force a reset on any improperly installed or illegally connected charging system. It had been tested, audited, and confirmed legal by Elena's hired consultant. Laura had registered the protocol with the county as part of her safety compliance upgrades. It was active, and it was waiting. The hall was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the center, and a sleek projector beamed Karen's presentation onto a makeshift screen. Bullet points, diagrams, colorful infographics about sustainable power integration and grid synergy. The irony wasn't lost on Laura. Karen had spent months undermining the very autonomy she now pretended to champion. But Karen wasn't just grandstanding. She was seeding suspicion. Throughout the presentation, she hinted at unregulated modifications, isolated incidents of system destabilization, and the risk of rogue installations undermining community trust. She never said Laura's name. She didn't need to. Every pointed glance, every strategic pause was calibrated to direct the room's attention toward the woman in the third row, sitting with arms crossed and expression unreadable. Then came the moment. Karen, in her flawless cream blouse and carefully rehearsed tone, transitioned from slides to a brief demonstration of community-integrated charging efficiency, motioning for the doors to be opened. Outside, parked near the entrance, was her Tesla Model Y, now reconnected to a freshly installed mobile charger, one Karen had clearly set up in anticipation of this event. The connection line ran from a nearby power tap approved by the council, but Laura had already suspected the truth. The circuit had been spliced, its internal sensor bypassed and rerouted into the same hidden line Karen had tried to resurrect weeks ago. She had been arrogant enough to reuse the pathway, assuming the previous failures were flukes, but now, in her effort to stage a public display of technical superiority, she had walked straight into the system Laura had designed to catch her. As the charger began its cycle, Laura's system, quietly listening from afar through its passive detection subroutine, recognized the draw pattern, a familiar signature, mismatched phase alignment, slight waveform jitter indicative of Karen's setup. It triggered the protocol. Within seconds, a backfeed surge traced the unauthorized route, reached the vehicle's inverter, and activated the Tesla's thermal safeguard. The car issued an audible warning, followed by a high-pitched whine from the rear motor. And then, as every eye in the room turned toward the entrance, the unmistakable hiss of vaporized insulation escaped from beneath the vehicle's hood, accompanied by a plume of acrid gray smoke. Gasps filled the hall. Someone shouted for a fire extinguisher. Karen, frozen near the podium, stared wide-eyed as her prized possession blinked and locked itself down, warning lights strobing in frantic red across the dashboard. The irony was suffocating. Her demonstration, designed to humiliate Laura, had short-circuited in front of 24 witnesses, not by sabotage, but by her own arrogance colliding with a system that no longer allowed her to steal undetected. Laura stood, not to gloat or explain, but simply to leave. By the time she reached the exit, a technician from the utility company, coincidentally attending the forum, was already examining the charger. When he pulled back the inspection panel, his frown deepened. "This shouldn't have been connected like this," he muttered. "There's no load balancing failover. This is a direct feed off an unverified line." Karen rushed to him, attempting to explain, but her voice was brittle, cracking under the weight of exposure. Laura didn't stay to hear the excuses. She stepped into the rain, letting it mask the static charge still buzzing in her veins. Later that evening, she returned to a quiet house. The lights responded to her presence with their usual gentle hum, and the workshop glowed with soft amber security strips. Everything was in order. No messages, no new mail. Just silence. She poured herself a drink, not to celebrate but to anchor herself. The point hadn't been to win, It had been to end the games. If Karen wanted to continue her theater, she'd have to do so with the weight of public embarrassment and the scrutiny of a utility board watching her every connection. Laura knew she hadn't eliminated the threat completely. People like Karen rarely disappear. But what she had done was introduce consequence into a space where entitlement had previously roamed unchecked. And more importantly, she had done it without stepping outside the boundaries of law, civility, or reason. She raised her glass, not in toast, but in affirmation. She hadn't needed revenge. She had needed clarity. And now, with every wire sealed, every log confirmed, every voltage stabilized by her own hand, she had it. In the days that followed the incident at the community hall, the neighborhood hummed with a different energy, not of tension or fear, but of quiet recalibration. Karen's name passed in hushed tones between porches and through hedgerows, whispered less with scorn than with the uncomfortable reverence reserved for someone who had flown too close to the sun and been scorched for it. Her Tesla remained parked, untouched and uncharged, as if frozen in time. The charger removed, the utility panel sealed by a tamper-evident lock placed by the county technician who had filed an official anomaly report. It was the kind of public marking that needed no further explanation. A silent declaration that her influence had met its match not through confrontation, but through consequence, and that the architecture she'd built on unspoken leverage had collapsed beneath the weight of exposure. Karen did not appear at the next council meeting. She issued no statements, made no phone calls, and did not attempt to spin the story in her favor. Whether out of shame, calculation, or legal advice, she vanished from the neighborhood's public life, her presence reduced to closed curtains and the occasional glimpse of her figure through a rain-streaked window. Word spread quietly that she had stepped down from her council role, though no official announcement followed. Her self-fashioned title as Technology and Safety Chair disappeared from the community bulletin board, replaced without fanfare by a list of upcoming landscaping restrictions and garbage pickup revisions. The order of things had reasserted itself, not through anger, but through the simple act of disinterest. The community had moved on, and in its own way that was the sharpest rebuke of all. Laura, for her part, did not gloat. She kept her systems clean, her reports archived, and her focus steady. The workshop resumed full function within 48 hours of the forum. Orders were fulfilled, deliveries dispatched, and slowly a few neighbors began to drift back into her orbit, not en masse, not with apologies, but with cautious respect. One stopped by to ask her thoughts on replacing an aging inverter. Another left a note in her mailbox with a question about surge protection. A couple waved as they passed, and Laura, without changing her pace, nodded in return. She didn't offer her help unsolicited. She didn't chase their attention. But she didn't shut her gate either. There was something profoundly clarifying in the aftermath. Not just the technical victory or the social vindication, but the way everything now sat in alignment. The boundaries she had established, legal, electrical, personal, had been tested, strained, and finally acknowledged. No one else tried to tap her system. No further complaints were filed. The campaign of interference ended not with a confrontation, but with an acknowledgement that she could not be coerced, that her expertise was not to be undermined by gossip or bureaucratic proxy wars. She had outlasted the noise by refusing to amplify it, and in doing so, she had altered the dynamic of the entire neighborhood. Her attorney, Elena, called her one afternoon just to say that no new legal activity had been registered under Karen's name. No further filings. No attempts at appeals. The restraining order remained in place, not challenged, not acknowledged. "You're clear," Elena had said, "and that silence? That's as close to a confession as you'll get in this kind of war." Laura had thanked her, made a note to renew the legal filings when they expired, and returned to her workbench where a new project waited. A hybrid microgrid kit designed for remote. Cabins, inspired in part by everything she'd endured. It wasn't revenge. It was evolution. Eventually, she walked the perimeter of her property one last time, confirming every panel, every conduit, every junction box. The system thrummed quietly beneath her fingertips, obedient, secure, resilient. She had rebuilt it stronger than before, not with vengeance, but with precision. She paused by the gate, where once the unauthorized line had slithered through the ground like a parasitic root. Now, only smooth gravel lay beneath, freshly packed and undisturbed. The ghosts of intrusion had been cleared, replaced by clarity. Laura didn't seek community after that, but she no longer avoided it. She was invited to speak at a nearby utility co-op event, not about the conflict, but about system hardening and autonomous grid design. She accepted, offered her insights, and returned home without broadcasting her involvement. Those who knew, knew. And those who didn't matter. Her systems spoke for her. Her silence spoke louder still. One evening, as the sky folded into twilight, Laura stood at her workbench polishing a generator housing when she noticed a light flicker across her driveway. A car paused at the edge, its headlights dimmed, and after a long moment, it moved on. She didn't need to see who it was. Karen might still pass by, still live behind her sealed windows, still carry her resentment like a relic, but it no longer reached across the fence. Inside, the lights adjusted to the descending darkness, their warm glow wrapping around the walls of the shop like memory. The air smelled of oil and solder and possibility. The hum of energy was no longer a battlefield. It was a promise, not of safety, but of readiness, of knowing that whatever storm might arrive next, she had already proven that she would not be moved. Laura turned off the main switch, checked the lock on the panel, and walked inside. The door clicked shut behind her, not in defiance, not in fear, but in resolution. The war had ended not with a bang, but with understanding. She had made her boundaries clear, and now they would hold.